I think this little box is exactly what I've been waiting for to install in my overland camper. This could be the ultimate solution to keep your EcoFlow power station charged in your small vehicle camper on the road without a massive solar panel taking up all the real estate on your roof. This system is almost perfect, and I'll explain why it is not exactly 100% perfect in a minute. But for now, you need to know that this little box right here in my hands will charge almost all EcoFlow batteries that have an XT150 port. And later this summer, EcoFlow will offer an XT60i cable to make this work with essentially all of their power stations. And while this is the first 3-in-1 fast charger, battery maintainer, and jump starter of its kind, providing up to 800 watts of DC to DC charging, it is restricted to just a few EcoFlow products to work. Speaking of EcoFlow, they sent me this product for a test and review. They asked for my honest feedback in this video, and that is exactly what they will get. So let's see what they sent. Inside the box, you get the EcoFlow Alternator Charger, which comes inside a very environmentally friendly packaging. And this thing is robust. It feels really heavy duty. It's got a metal case, and it just feels like a high quality item. And packaged up in that second box are all of the cables. This massive cable will go from your vehicle's battery or to your 12 to 24 volt system to the alternator charger. And this is the cable that will go from your EcoFlow alternator charger to your XT150 capable power station. Keep in mind, EcoFlow does plan to start selling an XT60i kit, or you can purchase that XT60i cable retroactively starting later this summer. The final item in your kit is going to be this fuse cable. This is going to go from your battery's positive terminal into the positive cable on that main wiring harness. And there is one small box that you're not going to want to miss while you're unpackaging your EcoFlow alternator charger, because this box has the bracket for if you want to hard mount this to your vehicle. It also has the nuts and bolts that you need to do that. And then the last thing that's most important is going to be this quick disconnect for the cables on the system. Now, you can disconnect the cables without this device, but you will have to get a little creative with moving those two tabs to disconnect the cables. However, if you don't lose this piece right here, it will be a lot easier to remove these cables by just simply pushing this in on the side and then disconnecting the cables. Now, if you're ready to get locked into the EcoFlow ecosystem, then you're in the right place. The one thing that has bothered me the most about relying on lithium batteries to power my overland camper is that many of my appliances consume a large amount of power. Every day that I'm out on the road, I make coffee, I cook a few meals, and I continuously run a small 12 volt refrigerator, keeping all of my perishable items and drinks cool. And while all of these tasks consume anywhere from 1 to 3 kilowatt hours of power every day, the solar panels that I frequently top off with can only support a small percentage of those demands. Let's head outside and I'll show you what I'm talking about. I did mic up because there are tons of cicadas out there, and if I don't wear the microphone, you're just not going to be able to hear what I'm saying. So the solar panel that I historically have kept on my vehicle produces maybe about 1 kilowatt hour of power per day. If I'm really lucky and I'm in really good conditions, I might get 1.5, and that's a 200 watt solar panel, but it essentially has to be in the sun at all times. And so I have not mounted it to the top of my Jeep because I was waiting for this alternator charger to come out so that I could install it and see if that completely eliminates my need for a solar panel. You can see this is the solar panel that I used to keep on my vehicle, and it is a massive solar panel. This one is a 180 watt solar panel, and in the same footprint you can get a 200 watt solar panel, But at 200 watts, assuming you have the maximum capability of the sun, the best angle possible, then you're only still going to get about 160 to 180 max out of this panel, which means you will also need 5 to 6 hours of those ideal sunlight conditions to get just 1 kilowatt hour of power. Although solar panels are great for what they do, they don't work in the shade, and they have to be at an ideal angle relative to the sun to achieve those maximum results. And this EcoFlow Alternator Charger can match those results in just over 1 hour of driving. I like traveling to get to my destination, so for me it's not a problem to rely on something like this to top off my batteries while I'm out exploring. And to be clear here, although this does have a simple and effective name of EcoFlow Alternator Charger, it does not in fact attach to your vehicle's alternator. It will attach to either your 12 or 24 volt system, which in my case is going to be the main charging battery or the main starting battery of my vehicle. Once the input signal from the alternator begins to charge that battery, then this alternator charger will receive the signal that tells it it is getting a high enough voltage that it can take some of that voltage and convert it into battery power for your EcoFlow power station. And you remember how earlier I said this thing is almost perfect, but it's not 100% perfect? Well, there are two reasons that I believe that it's not 100% perfect. And the first reason is that this is only compatible with the EcoFlow Delta 2, Delta 2 Max, Delta Pro 2000, I think it was an older Delta Max 2000, and one more that I can't recall. But since I started filming this video over the last few days, I did find out that EcoFlow does plan to provide that XT60i adapter cable that will allow you to charge almost all of the EcoFlow devices. And on top of that, you can charge the Wave 2 battery, and I will definitely test that in this video because I have heard that some folks out in testing have had issues with that system. And the second problem, which EcoFlow really can't do anything about, is if your vehicle's charging system is not robust. Meaning, if you don't have a high output alternator, then this EcoFlow Alternator Charger can draw down your system's power capability. And what I mean by that is, this thing takes just about 70 to 80 amps from your vehicle's alternator. In my case, my alternator has a 180 amp capability. And so that's taking 80 of that, leaving 100 amps remaining for the vehicle to operate, to run my headlights, to recharge my battery, maybe to run my winch if I need it. And so that is something that I have to keep in mind when I'm installing this. I can overtax the charging system, and it could cause the alternator to prematurely wear out. But I have been thinking ahead with this problem, and so what I have done recently is purchased an alternator from a Jeep Gladiator with the max tow package. And so this is a 220 amp alternator, which I bought for about 200 bucks off eBay. And this will give me just a little more power so that when I'm maxing out that Delta 2 Max with the 800 watts of input, I'll still be getting about 140 amps into the main vehicle system. And that is something that no matter what brand it is, if you do plan to have a DC to DC alternator charger, you may need to consider upgrading your alternator. I'm gonna save this alternator install for another day, so this week I'll be able to test this with the stock alternator. And on top of that, if you feel like the EcoFlow Alternator Charger is pulling too much power from your system, you can lower its charging wattage through the app. For today's install, I plan to run this alternator charger from the vehicle's battery through some of the pillars into the back seat of my vehicle. And the reason for that is my Delta 2 Max is not waterproof. And so I don't want to risk damaging it if I put it, for example, in the bed of my truck. I'm also going to wait to install the fuse until after I'm done routing the cable wherever I want it to go. And the reason is that this little box right here could get caught up on something as I'm pushing the cable through some of those trim pieces. The cable for the alternator charger is just about 16 feet long, so it's going to be plenty of cable for me to run this from the back of my cabin here into my hood compartment. I'm gonna go ahead and string out the entire cable, and the reason is I wanna make sure that this part of the cable and as much of the excess is in this compartment so that when I attach this to the alternator charger, I can move it around and find the perfect place to install it. I'm also gonna leave these protectors on the cables until I get them routed to where I want them, just to prevent any unwanted arcing. And I know that I don't have any power source attached yet, but it's just a better practice to keep things protected as long as possible. So now I've approximately ran just enough cable to make sure that I can get this thing wired through the doorway, through the panels. I'm gonna go ahead and start routing it through my panels. I'm gonna snake this through the rest of the way later, but I've got the cable just ran under this panel here. I'm gonna put it under this panel later as well. I've got it run into the passenger compartment, and then I used a small trim tool to just pull this piece of trim out and route that thing behind the trim. Now I'm gonna try to feed as much of that slack as possible straight up into the length that I need for the engine compartment, so that once I get it high enough, I can route it under this panel and straight to the battery. And I was just almost able to fish this through without getting it snagged, but it looks like I'm gonna have to go ahead and remove it. And this panel comes off very easily. It's just got 4 bolts that holds it in place. Once those 4 bolts are out of the way, this panel just pops right out. And so there's the issue right there. These 2 cables, I want to keep them together as I fish them through. And in case you're curious, this is the cable that I use for my dash cam on the vehicle. And now everything's together, I just want to pull that through as much as I can get it. Plenty of play there. Now I've got just enough cable so that when I'm ready to install it, I've got my positive terminal and my negative terminal on my battery. Now let me get some of this dialed in, and then I'm going to put this panel back on so I don't forget it. If you're gonna use a tool like this, make sure you put it on 1 before you deal with any kind of small bolts like that. And then I'm just gonna give it a little bit on 2, not too much, just to make sure they're torqued down. So remember how we saved this fuse for later? Well, now it's later. I'm gonna go ahead and open that up just by squeezing it. And I'm gonna attach the positive cable to the fuse first, so that if there's any issues with my system, I won't blow out my system, but rather blow this fuse. And holding this fuse system together is a little tiny baby 8mm nut with a lock washer. Now that I've got that lock washer loose, I'm gonna find my positive cable here, pull off that protector that I left in place earlier. And I do want to point out that the hole for the positive cable is tiny, and that is to help indicate that if you do forget to put on the fuse, this won't necessarily attach well to any of the cables directly on your battery. So that's a great thing to keep in mind. Now I'm going to tighten this up. Keep in mind at this point I still have not connected anything to the alternator charger itself. So essentially both of the ends of this on the other side are not connected to anything. Also trying to help reduce some of the risk of breaking or damaging anything as I start this process. To avoid any issues with my electrical system, I'm going to use the stubby ratchet here with a 13mm socket. I'm going to go ahead and connect my negative terminal first. Try not to lose this nut, because when I installed my winch, I did lose one of the nuts. Luckily I had a few extra nuts laying around, but it's best to just not lose them if you can avoid that. Now that I've got that ground terminal essentially where I want it, I'm gonna go ahead and tighten up just a little bit. Not too tight, I don't want to break anything, but just tight enough knowing that I'm not going to lose that or it's not going to go anywhere. Same thing with my positive terminal. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect one of the 13 mils on the main terminal bar. Once I get that off, again, not trying to lose it. Oh crap. Same thing here. Now that I've got it generally in place, want to go ahead and use my stubby ratchet and just tighten that down. Again, I'm using the stubby ratchet just because I don't want to risk touching anything, maybe arcing the battery with the terminals, anything like that, while I'm tightening that up. Sufficiently tight, nothing's moving. I'm going to go ahead and put the terminal protector back down in its spot. So that's essentially the nuts and bolts of a install under the hood. Now what I want to do is go ahead and close my hood because I don't really need to be under here anymore today. I want to go to the back and see exactly how this system works. I don't want to forget to install any of my panels here, so I'm going to go ahead and put this panel in. It's a little bit of a tight fit because that cable is in the spot essentially where the panel goes. But once I got it in there, just like new. I left myself plenty of excess cable so I could move the box around once it's installed. So let's go ahead and, moment of truth, let's get this thing installed and see, did I do it properly? Now the good thing is, the way the cable is designed and the way this socket is, it will only go on the one way. So I've got it at least plugged into the box, and before I go any further, I don't see or smell or hear anything that indicated that I blew a fuse, but I want to go ahead and get the app on and make sure that I have the current firmware for the alternator charger. Oh, that feels so good. Okay, so I've got the EcoFlow Delta 2 Max hooked up, and then I've got the Wave 2 hooked up straight to the Delta 2 Max, and the Delta 2 Max has 2 ports on the side. One of the ports is actually currently hooked up to the EcoFlow Alternator Charger, but my vehicle is not on, and the Delta 2 Max was at 100% battery when I started. So what I'm going to do for the next hour or so is just let this air conditioner system pull power so I can draw down some of the power from the Delta 2 Max so that I can fully test the features of the alternator charger. I do want to point out that as it's set up right now, it says that the Wave 2 will run for approximately 7 hours on max mode off of the Delta 2 Max, and it's currently not pulling any power from the vehicle's battery. The signal that it's not charging is pretty simple. It's currently got this red light. When you do lower the voltage to either 11 for this to begin charging, or when the vehicle's alternator is putting power in, then it will turn green, indicating that it is charging something in the system. Disconnected the alternator charger from the Delta 2 Max because I want to plug in the alternator charger directly to the Wave 2's battery. And I love the fact that this cable does have an angled input, because these straight inputs are kind of annoying to find the perfect position. However, in this one case, when trying to hook it up to the Wave 2 battery, I've got to leave it on a ledge so that it will not, hang over and stress that cable. All right, so I've got the Wave 2 battery hooked up directly into the alternator charger. The battery is on, and I want to see, does the alternator charger recognize the Wave 2 battery? All right, guys, so that's something I will have to check with EcoFlow. I've got the battery hooked up. I've got the cables hooked up in the only way that they will hook up, but the Wave 2 battery is simply not recognized by the system right now. So there's essentially nothing that I can do. Maybe I'm going to try one more thing, which is lower the voltage for the alternator charger down to its minimum to see if it will still not recognize the Wave 2 battery. Since the alternator charger is not hooked up to a device that it recognizes, it simply will not allow the voltage or any of those other options in the menu to be changed. So I'm going to hook it back up to the Delta 2 Max and attempt to update the firmware one more time. I did recently update all of these firmwares, but I guess it just didn't work for me. And returning the power to the Delta 2 Max instantly illuminated that red battery indicator on the alternator charger. So if EcoFlow gives me an update on this device and says, hey, the Wave 2 battery will charge with it, I'll post that in either the video description or one of the top comments. And running that Wave 2, even though I'm just standing right here outside of the vehicle, I've got that cold breeze running right on the back of my head. It honestly feels really good, and it's pulling about almost exactly 500 watts from the Delta 2 Max. So now at this rate, I would say I probably have about 3.5 hours remaining from the Delta 2 Max to run this AC on max mode. And just so I don't make a mess with the system, I'm going to go ahead and rotate the Wave 2 so that the drain here is over the table, hanging out so that it just drains straight onto the ground. So I'm gonna let this sit like this for a couple of hours. I do want to point out that normally I would not leave electronics like this, especially this black box, in direct sunlight, but perhaps if I leave it in the sun, I will discover if it has any issues with the heat that you would get from being inside of something like my Jeep here. Direct sunlight will heat up that thing pretty quickly, and so it's not really hot now, but we'll see what happens over the next couple of hours. The Delta 2 Max is down to 60% and the Wave 2 is pulling just over 400 watts. I've let this thing go for about 2 hours and I don't want to sit out here all day and let this thing burn all the way down. So I'm ready to start moving these items into the Jeep so I can get it started and see how the alternator charger performs with the Jeep running. For today, I'm just gonna go ahead and leave these seats up. I'm gonna put the alternator charger on one seat and then I'm gonna put the Delta 2 Max on the other seat. In fact, the system's so compact that I'm just gonna leave the alternator charger right on top of the Delta 2 Max for now. Before I get too sweaty in this vehicle, I'm gonna go ahead and get the engine started. I've got my screen recording here on the app, and what I wanna see is, will the alternator charger immediately start? Keep in mind, my vehicle has what they call a smart alternator, and what that will do is it will use a voltage regulator to control the voltage going from the alternator into the battery. But I think that as long as I maintain the load on the alternator from this charging system, that it will continue to provide power, because the alternator is also getting a signal that it requires power. So far we're only hitting about 360 watts, and what I want to do is go ahead and hook up my charger here for my phone, and I want to drive the vehicle a little bit. Since I've been watching this thing over the last few minutes, I've not received more than about 300 watts from the alternator charger. Setting my air conditioner to full power is possibly a problem because I am essentially using all of the power from the alternator to feed the air conditioner and now the alternator charger. I did change it to turn on at the 12 volt setting. Now the engine is reading 13 volts on the system here. My vehicle is showing 12.7 volts, but I'm getting 768 watts from the alternator into the alternator charger and into my Delta 2 Max. So my only concern with that is I don't want any power to be drawn from the Jeep while the engine is off. And if I leave it at that 12 volt setting, then there will be some amount of power pulled into the Delta 2 Max after the engine is off and until the starter battery is drawn down to 12 volts. So I don't really like that. I would prefer to see something along the lines of, hey, maybe I put it at 12.5 volts. So inside of the firmware for the EcoFlow control here, they change it to be more controllable to a minimum voltage of by the 10th, so 12.1, 12.2, where once it reaches that 12.5 or 12.6, which is usually the resting voltage of a battery, then it will, or a 12 volt lead acid battery, then it will shut off and prevent overdrawing from the lead acid battery. So I've been running my HVAC system on max. I'm getting a steady 760 to 770 out of the system. I'm gonna now try to drop that battery voltage to 11 to see if that pulls even more power from the battery system. But one thing that I'm a little concerned with, and I'm gonna test this in a second here, is if I have the 12 volt low setting, will the thing continue to charge the battery after I shut off the engine? So I'm going to try that right now. Let me put this back on the 12 volt setting, and now that it's on the 12 volt setting, I'm going to go ahead and shut off the engine and see what happens here. So the charging voltage is still going, but it's going down to, I'm really hoping it goes down to 0. It's been about 10-15 seconds. I'm just going to let this go and see what I stop at here in a minute. My battery voltage is showing 12 on my gauges here on the engine. And so that is something that, as I stated, I do not want to be pulling power from the battery much beyond when the engine is running. So I'm still pulling about 500 watts, which to me is way too much power. I'm currently idling the engine. I am in park. I've got the AC still on max mode, and I'm having no problems getting that 760 watts from the alternator on the vehicle. The battery voltage on the vehicle does read 12.8, and that further reinforces essentially why I wish I could further change the starting voltage on the alternator charger somewhere between 12.2 to 12.5, so that I'm getting maximum charge above 12.5 volts, and then once I hit that 12.5 volts or less, when I shut off the engine, then I stop pulling power from the battery alternator system, and it protects my starter battery from any kind of damage. But this is a good time to mention the alternator charger also acts as a reverse charger. So if I did drain my battery down like I'm describing, then I could take the power from the Delta 2 Max, top off that charging battery or that starter battery one more time. In addition to that, it does have a battery maintenance mode, and so if I was going to leave the vehicle for a long period of time, I would set it in battery maintenance mode, and I would not have to worry about draining down the power on the starter battery. You gotta remember, these lead acid starter batteries are not meant to be drawn down to a low voltage very often. Once or twice, maybe you start to do a little bit of damage to those starter batteries. So I really want to protect that starter battery as much as possible. So just in an effort to see if I could get that 800 watts from the system, I went ahead and turned off the HVAC system, and I'm still set at that 12 volt minimum. And as you can see, I'm getting just about 800 watts into the Delta 2 Max. I do want to point out that I ran into the gas station real quick, got some gas for my lawnmower, and while I was in there for the approximately 5 to 10 minutes, I came out, the system was still putting about 500 watts into the Delta 2 Max. So that further reinforces, I know I've said this several times, but it further reinforces that I want to be able to control that voltage a little more closely than just by the integers 12, 11, 12, 13, up to 30. So I'm very happy that EcoFlow brought us this new technology, and I feel like there's two things that I would change or improve to make this thing 100% perfect. And the first is, I'm happy that EcoFlow is coming out with that XT60i cable, which will allow this thing to charge some of its smaller power stations, such as the River 2, River 2 Pro, and River 2 Max, or possibly an upcoming River 3 if they're going to come up with that system. But I feel like what would make this even better is if they offered this with an MC4 cable outlet, so you could plug it directly into any power station that requires power. Now, I would understand if you had to limit that maybe to 500 watts or less, but that would still be much better than only limiting this to the EcoFlow ecosystem. Now, the second thing that I would definitely improve, and this is as easy as a firmware update, is changing that voltage input to a more specific 12.5, 12.6 user-defined input. That would give this much better capability. It would also ease my mind about drawing down my starter battery when my vehicle is not running, because I absolutely do not want to do that. I feel like that firmware update will come very soon, and I will post that information as well in the video description or in the first comment or a pinned comment. Now, if you do want to find out more about the EcoFlow Alternator Charger, check out the link in the video description. And if you want an even better deal on their advertised price, use my discount code, and I'll see you guys on my next adventure.